Well, session number 82 in Mark, looking this time at chapter 14, verses 53 through 65. Not only in Mark, but we'll look at verses from the other three gospel writers as well. The title, The Trial, Formal Arraignment. We know by John's testimony that the preliminary interrogation at Annas got nowhere, produced no useful data for an indictment, and especially for any capital charge. A capital mean, of course, that there's a death penalty associated with it. Mark sets up the visit at Caiaphas by beginning this way, and we've read this before. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together. That's the Sanhedrin. And and Peter had followed him at a distance. Probably thought he was safe there or something. We don't know. But he followed him right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now, Mark tends to put all of these trials by the Jews under one heading. He does not touch on the work at Caiaphas at all, nor does he separate out the morning events that actually led to the charges. Verse 53 is unclear again as to whether it's a reference to Annas, who was the high priest in AD 4 to 6, or to Caiaphas, who was the high priest AD 18 to 36. Now, while we are here, let's talk about some of the sons and the grandson of Annas, who were also high priest at one point. Eleazar, his son, AD 16 to 17. That would have been before Caiaphas. Jonathan, AD 36 to 37. That would have been after Caiaphas. Theophilus, AD 37 to 41. Also, of course, after Caiaphas, and Matthias, AD 61, 30 years after Christ's execution, roughly. And his grandson Matthias, I don't know if Matthias was Matthias's son, or whether he was the son of Eleazar or Jonathan or Theophilus. But anyhow, he was high priest from AD 65 to 66. And those are the years from about AD 30 to 33 until about AD 66, when Matthias was the high priest, his grandson, or AD 67, 68. That was the time when Paul and Peter would have been executed by Nero. Nero would have been on the throne. So we're spanning the time from the crucifixion for about another 35 years, say. Now, this one at Caiaphas is going to be a trial for looking for some capital offense with a death penalty. It's no better today than it was yesterday, folks. This is a formal arraignment. It's a formal trial in which the indictment and statement of charges is going to be formed. At least some indictment and statement of charges is going to be formed. And then they'll be finally put into an indictment in the morning. in just a few hours from this particular point of time. The Sanhedrin believed Jesus had to die in order to get rid of what they considered the Jesus problem. He was going to cost them influence and power in their own right, so they thought. But something to keep in mind, again, we've talked about it, a guilty conviction for a Jewish religious violation, destroying a place of worship or blasphemy, and that would be of zero interest to the Romans. And the Romans had to execute Jesus in order that the Sanhedrin might not be blamed for taking his life. It also required, in order to have certain aspects of prophecy fulfilled. However, the Romans under Pilate would require a political finding of guilt, such as sedition or outright armed revolt. But in this trial, which should have been held in daylight rather than night, dark, and it was held likely between midnight and 3 a.m., the cockcrow watch on Nisan 15. Remember, the upper room experience took place during Nisan 15, after it had crossed over from Nisan 14 at sundown to be Nisan 15, the day of Passover, the first day of the 7 or 8 day fiesta, festival, take your pick. Keep in mind that Jesus was arrested again after sundown on Nisan 14, which meant that it was actually Nisan 15 by Jewish reckoning, the first day of Passover and unleavened bread. Jewish law required, by the way, that the trial be held immediately after arrest. And that's happening. It just is happening at night. However, a finding of guilt in a capital case had to be found the following day. In other words, there had to be time to think about it, I guess. That would mean that the guilty plea should have been rendered on Nisan 16, but it was going to be registered on Nisan 15. Now, Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin were about to sit in judgment of Jesus, not realizing, keep this in mind, a bit of irony here, that on the day of the Lord, that Jesus' return, he would come back and sit in final and absolute judgment on them, along with everyone else. We're given that clue in Revelation 1, verse 7. This is by John, of course, also. Behold, he, the Messiah, is coming with the clouds from, let me see what, Daniel 7, 13, 14. And every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And we're not to the cross yet. We're not to the point of the piercing, but even in Revelation, some 60 years probably after the execution, John writes, every eye will see Jesus, even those who pierced him. And all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him. Even so, amen. We'll see that Old Testament quote in a moment again from Daniel before we're through with this single activity. Mark then continued describing the sitting judges and the activity itself. Reading, say, verse 55 of Mark 14. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus. If they had to keep trying to obtain testimony, that whatever they were getting was not true testimony. It was false or defective in some way, shape, or form, because they were trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any. Verse 56, for they were giving false testimony against him, and yet their testimony was not consistent. They couldn't lie and be consistent. The Sanhedrin, of course, consists of 71 members, and a quorum of 23 was required to conduct this trial. So we figure they had somewhere between 23 and 71 present. It's a bit of speculation, probably, because if they were going to cheat on some of the principles, maybe the number would also be one they could cheat on. So who knows? Mark said the whole council was in attendance, but the language doesn't really imply that all 71 were present. Just enough had come together, all together, to constitute a quorum and to be getting on with the event. They were looking for a guilty verdict, and 2 charges under Jewish law could deliver a guilty verdict: a charge of destroying a place of worship and a charge of blasphemy. But by the way, what was the method of death, conducting the death penalty? Stoning, not crucifixion. A little slow today. However, in capital cases, Jewish law required at least 2 witnesses to be in substantial agreement. That really means their testimony had to essentially be equal, not identical, but equal in terms of what was said and the inferences from it. That's told us in Deuteronomy, first in 17:6, verse 6 of chapter 17. On the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, he who is to die shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. So if the witnesses can't agree close enough to say, yeah, they're in agreement, they couldn't put him to death. And then down to 19:15 in Deuteronomy, chapter 19, verse 15. A single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. So the defendant himself was essentially exempted from examination that might constitute self-incrimination. The verdict must rely on the agreeing testimony of 2 or more others. Remember the first thing they started doing? Asking Jesus questions. And that's the last thing they will do also. Not what they've already asked, But this event will end when Christ testifies. Apparently, there were many false witnesses that the Sanhedrin had secured. And they were present and they were given a lot of false testimony. What does that make you think of? If they had a ton of people that are ready to testimony but hadn't had time to check out their testimony, they had to be selected and pulled together quickly in the middle of the night. Interestingly, perjured testimony was grounds for dismissal of the charges. But the members of the Sanhedrin didn't give up. They continued to try. Let's move to verses 57 and 58. And some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands." Now, do you remember that was back in John chapter 2, where Christ was talking about his own body, and he didn't say he would destruct it. He said, if it's destructed, if my body is destroyed, then I will rebuild it within 3 days, meaning he will be resurrected within 3 days. But, so they probably mixed that, which is again John 2, verses 19 through 22. Where Jesus spoke of a temple being torn down and rebuilt in 3 days. The temple in question was his own body, not the physical temple in Jerusalem. But these guys may have also heard him say, as recorded in Mark 13, that Jesus had prophesied on the destruction of the physical temple that was to take place in AD 70. And they may put it together, put him as the root cause and blame, and then made their testimony. But apparently, even on that, the witnesses were still garbled, corrupted, misinterpreted what Jesus had said, and they were trying to come up with some way of getting a charge of destroying a place of worship, excuse me, which was a capital offense under Jewish law. Such a verdict might also imply that Jesus intended to set up a new system of worship foreign to Judaism. If he's going to destroy the temple and then rebuild a new one, then it'll be his new religion, right? It won't be God's own plan. It'll be this guy's plan. So again, in the Middle East, again, that was a reason for death. But the desires of the Sanhedrin were squelched because they couldn't agree. In verse 59 of Mark 14, and not even in this respect, even under these conditions of these things, what Jesus had prophesied versus what he had said about himself, not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. So they couldn't agree. And so now Caiaphas is probably about to have a snit fit. He's going to go into a snit because they have to throw all custom and all law aside and to do something to get a charge against Jesus. So what are they going to do? Caiaphas is going to put Jesus under a vow to God to coerce him into testifying. Talk about being forced to testify against yourself. That's fundamentally what Caiaphas is going to do in verse 60. And the high priest, Caiaphas, stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, not witnesses, questioned the defendant, saying, "Do you make no answer?" These guys are making all these charges. What is it that these men are testifying against you? So Caiaphas says, at least open your mouth and tell us what these guys are talking about and your response to it, because his response then could be used as testimony. He was looking for Jesus to incriminate himself in violation of Israeli law. Verse 61, but he, that's Jesus, kept silent and made no answer. That doesn't stop Caiaphas. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And of course, the Blessed One is a way to describe God without using his name, Yahweh. So he said, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed God?" And the language used actually implies that Caiaphas continually kept requesting a response from Jesus. It wasn't a one-time request. It was over and over and over. And Matthew describes this a little bit in chapter 26. In verses 62 and 63, Matthew writes this, "And the high priest," that's Caiaphas, "stood up and said to him," Jesus, "Do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure," here's the pressure, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Now, Matthew doesn't have problem saying God. Notice the preface to Caiaphas' last request. He put Jesus under oath to answer his question. That means that Jesus was forced to answer the two-item question, and he did. But what are the two items? Do you claim to be the Messiah? Christ, Christos in Greek. Do you claim to be God's Son, therefore God also? Why is the identifying of two claims important? Because the Jewish mindset on the Messiah. Let me describe that a second. In Judaism at that time, the Messiah was purely man, only man, a very special man with a very special task, but only a man. If Jesus were to answer the formative, he would be testifying to be a man on one hand and God on the other hand. Blasphemy on the face of it, under the assumption that a man is not and cannot be God. Not only does Jesus answer in the affirmative, he throws the name of Yahweh in their face. Mark 14:62. And Jesus said, "I am Yahweh." I am, which was God's name given to Moses to give to Israel. God identified himself as I am or as you've heard me say any number of times, Yahweh. I refuse to use Jehovah typically because there is a heresy, a sect claiming to be Christian who claims that Jesus is not God and would claim that he was a man alone, imbued with the spirit of Michael the archangels. So a special man, but not divine. So Jesus said, this is in verse 62, I am. So Jesus said, Yahweh, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Several factors in there. Yahweh said, I am divine. And you're going to see the Messiah, Son of Man, from Daniel, refers to a man being made king. So you're going to see a king sitting at the right hand of power, meaning the right hand of God. So while you're going to kill him, you're going to see him going to the right hand of God, sitting at God's right hand, and coming back from the heavens on the clouds or with the clouds. So Jesus said, I am, declared him to be divine, adds that he'll be sitting on God's right hand, means he has to be resurrected and then ascends to that position, a place of all power and influence. Then he quoted from Psalm and from Daniel, citing that identifies him as the Messiah and therefore a king. Now we're into stuff that does matter, folks. Psalm 110:1, the Lord says to my Lord, and you heard Jesus use this as a reference to himself as the Son of David, Messiah, sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies a footstool for thy feet. Only a king has enemies that will be his footstool. Daniel 7:13 and 14. Daniel speaking as he's had some visions. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, which would be God, and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, kingship, glory, and a kingdom, that all of the peoples, nations, and men of every language will not. His dominion is an ever I'm skipping around. Then all peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. Who do you serve? The King. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So Jesus said, when I return, you will see I have been anointed king. He didn't say it in those terms, but that's what's coming out of all of this from Daniel and the Psalms. So according to Jewish thought, in error even though it was, Jesus had just committed blasphemy, claiming to be both Messiah, King, man and God. Look at an adjoining or a connecting verse from Leviticus chapter 24, two verses, in fact, 15 and 16. God talking to Moses, "And you shall speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if anyone curses his God, then he shall bear his sin." But remember, Christ had no sin. Verse 16. "Moreover, the one who blasphemes, the one who curses God, the name of the Lord," anybody who blasphemes the name of the Lord, "shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall certainly stone him." The alien as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death. So there it is. It was a penalty to blaspheme God, his name, and Jesus, they said, was doing it by claiming to be God himself. Well, the high priest did something. Look at Mark 14, 63 and 64. This essentially ends this arraignment process. "And tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you?" He's essentially saying, you heard it from his own lips. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. The high priest could not have had his royal robes on because he was not permitted to tear his royal robes. So if he had his royal robes on, that means he had to tear his drawers a bit. It's not likely. He probably had some civilian clothes on and tore those. It's supposed to be a form of mourning, or can you believe this side of thing. But it was hypocritical because they've been working to rig this out all night, even before it began, even before Jesus entered Jerusalem. They had decided to get rid of him. So it was a hypocritical act, not a true, valid act of remorse or mourning. Caiaphas' question, of course, was rhetorical. Jesus had just incriminated himself by his own words, but there was more as the arraignment ended. I mean, Caiaphas is done talking now, but look what happens next. Some began, notice before, all agreed. Now, not all of them agree with what follows, but some did, probably temple guards. Some began to spit at him and to blindfold him and to beat him with their fists and to say to him, prophesy. And I think it's in Matthew, he says, prophesy who it is that's striking you. He's blindfolded, so he can't see them. So they're mocking him because it says, and the officers received him with slaps in the face. So it probably was the temple guard. Could have been Roman soldiers, but more likely was the temple guard. So it starts with spitting, probably the most vile, hateful form of persecution, an act of repudiation and rejection. Not physically hurting, of course, but it was a terrible display of rejection. The blindfold was a curiosity, was particular there because Jesus was being taunted and mocked. Why? Because they said, "You're a fake Jesus. You're a blasphemer. There's no way if I blind you that you can see who is hitting you." But it wasn't quite believed that way. They do it because they're saying, and this is why it's part of the mocking. Matthew 26:68 puts it this way. And they said, that's these guys who are slugging him, "Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you." And so you got to go to Isaiah to see why they thought this was a mocking. They knew if Jesus was fake, they knew he couldn't see who was hitting him. But if he was the Messiah, they believed he could see even though he was blindfolded. I guess he could smell him. But let's look at this in Isaiah 11. I'm going to read the first 4 verses of Isaiah 11. "Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse." That, of course, we know refers to Jesus and the Messiah. "And a branch from his roots will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him." If you remember, that's the first thing Jesus taught in a sermon he gave in Luke 4, right after his baptism. "The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord." That means he's going to have knowledge and insights that other people don't have. You can see where this may be going. "He will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will judge by what he will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear. So it says it doesn't matter. The Messiah is not going to use his sight and his hearing to judge, nor make a decision by what he hears, he said. I read that again. "But with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth, and will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked." So their belief in this apparently was that if he were the true Messiah, he didn't need to see, he didn't need to hear. He had a spirit about him which allows him to know of all injustice without sight and hearing. So they said, okay, blindfold him and see if he knows who hit him. We'll make fun of him in that way. So there you have it. All done quickly in the dark of the night, I guess because delays would have let the word of evil being done get out, and the incense of many of the pilgrim, and incense many of the pilgrims. Not make them fragrant, but it will make them angry. So if what was being done got out to those who came to Passover, they would get out, they would get angry, they would become a mob, and they would have real trouble on your hands if you were the leadership of Israel. But also consider that Roman legal proceedings generally began early in the mornings, perhaps by 6 a.m. So they had to get this over with before 6 in the morning. They had to come up with a guilty plea so they could get it to Pilate at the time he would most likely begin taking on cases to a judge. Quite interesting thought, however. How did Christians get hold of the hearing by the Sanhedrin? Now, a couple possibilities. One is that maybe John was in the room. We don't know. Maybe Jesus described this to them later. But how about the possibility that there were believers, or some who would soon be believers, who were on the Sanhedrin? Think about it. Joseph of Arimathea, who came to Jesus by night early in his ministry. There were some apparently on the Sanhedrin who became Christians, at least at some point, if not by this point, at some point. So there may be have been a number of sources from whom true believers could get this information. But there's something else we're going to look at coming up next, I think, probably. I say next, but it's probably going to be after one more session. One more Jewish thing to be done, remember. That is, the Sanhedrin has to meet once again in the morning, in the daylight, to finalize the indictment listing the charges before turning Jesus over to the Romans. So these guys are trying to get this all done so that by 6 a.m. they can meet, come up with something to bring and make a charge against Christ before Pilate. So our focus after that, we will then likely look at Peter's failings. We'll see how it plays out. But after the final decision is made by the Sanhedrin at about 6 a.m. in daylight, where it seems legal, we're going to then move the focus to the Roman 3-stage examination of Jesus as Pilate jousts with the Jews before caving in and has Jesus crucified. So we still got more to go ways before we get to Calvary. Hang in there. It's deep, it's dark, it's exciting, however, and we're trying to pick up things that perhaps you have not seen or heard before. We're not trying to make up anything new, but this is stuff that's been known the whole time. But generally, the illegality of the Roman court system is generally discussed, sometimes erroneously, by the way. And then we're simply going to try and get some things that you don't typically focus on, like the difference between Jewish requirements for death and Roman requirements for death, the different methods of dealing with a conviction on a death sentence by Jews versus by Romans. And those of you who know something from prophecy in the Old Testament know that the Romans had to kill Jesus. The Jews stoning Jesus would not have fulfilled the prophecy.